Okay, so today is section three, and we're getting into like the history part of the U.S. and government, and leading up to the creation of our, United States. So we're going to go through the causes of the American Revolution. So the learning target is just to assess the impact of decisions of the colonists that led to the American War and the Declaration of Independence from Britain. So we're just going to go through year by year and talk about different things that happened. And yeah, so I'll do that. So in 1763, this is really when the Americans start getting frustrated with Britain's limiting of freedoms and just restrictions. So the French and Indian War ends. What had happened was the French had control of the Ohio River Valley, so like Appalachian Mountains, and like Midwest, but in between like Ohio, Tennessee, Kentucky, kind of like there. The British wanted it so they could trade with Native Americans who were living in that area, take advantage of the Native Americans. As usual, the French and the Indians fought against the British and the colonists. So the French and Indian War is kind of confusing because it probably should be French and British War, but yeah. So the British enlisted the colonists to fight for them. British eventually won. It was not a cheap war. A lot of things happened. And then, after the British won, they had a proclamation of 1763. So what they said was, hey, colonists, you guys helped win the war for us and probably did most of the work. It just seems since it's like in their country. You cannot have the new land that we just got. So you cannot move west. Even though your population is growing, we want this. As you can imagine, the colonists were not pleased. They wanted to expand, they wanted to move, and the British wouldn't let them. So we're going to go to 1764. And the British created or put into effect the Sugar Act. So this, what they tried to do was they tried to like do good and while like doing bad at the same time. So first they lowered the tax rate on molasses. They figured that if it's lower, people won't smuggle it. But they also added taxes to new products that they hadn't had before: wine, coffee, indigo, which is like a dye, and sugar. This is where the phrase "the no taxation without representation" comes from. So they lowered the tax on one thing, but added taxes to a bunch of other things. The no taxation without representation means that we shouldn't be taxed if we don't have representation in the government, or we don't have our voice in the government, which the colonists did not have. They also put in place the Currency Act. So this kind of banned like the paper use in colonies to try to slow inflation. So like, what am I trying to say? So they couldn't have like as much money, because if there was more money, then it's going to cause inflation, and then like the currency isn't going to be worth as much. In 1765, they had the Stamp Act. So the British realized that they needed more money because of the debt from the French and Indian War. So this is where they started taxing like anything paper. They taxed newspapers, they taxed postscripts, wills, deeds, diplomas. It needed to have a stamp on there saying that it was, paid for. So this is when the Sons of Liberty was formed by Samuel Adams, not the beer person. This was a protest, and what they did was they boycotted British goods. The Stamp Act was then repealed in 1776. And then we have the Quartering Act, which, when we go through the Bill of Rights, the Quartering Act, or like the amendment on the quartering, like you can't quarter soldiers, it felt really random, like before learning about this, and now it's like, oh, it makes sense why you would have this in your top 10 amendments. So what the Quartering Act was if British soldiers were in need of a room, a place to stay, lodging, accommodations, they had to put them up. So colonists would have to, by this act, provide room and board for British soldiers, and they didn't, like, they had to pay it out of their own pockets, so they had to give them a place to stay, food, and anything else they needed. Which, if you had an uninvited guest who, so like, you have a cousin that you don't like at all, and they're coming over for Christmas, and they say, all right, well, or your aunt says, yep, so your cousin's going to come stay with you, and you have to do whatever they want and feed them and make sure everything is good for them. And I want to hear back that they had a great time with you. You hate this cousin, but you have to deal with them for a week because the person in charge, your aunt or your mom or whoever, says you have to. That's kind of what it is. You don't want uninvited house guests. Then comes the Townshend Act, which is also called the Revenue Act. So this, once again, they're taxing more stuff. They tax glass, they tax lead, paper again, and paint and tea. If you didn't pay, you went to court with no jury. So the court with no jury, you're just having the government or the judge, who is going to be British, gonna look at you saying, oh, you didn't pay your taxes. Do you think they're gonna let you off? Probably not. It also came across the writ of assistance. So this allowed warrants for officers to search anywhere for evidence of smuggling. They didn't need a reason. So if you think about it, there's like anonymous tip lines and stuff you can do. So now, if you have an angry neighbor, or you annoy a neighbor, or you're really annoyed with a neighbor and you want to get back at them, you can just tell the officer, hey, I think they're smuggling goods from wherever, or they're not paying their taxes on whatever. Then that gives the officers a reason to search, or the colonists or the militia, or not militia, military, to go look for evidence of smuggling. So you could get back at your neighbor for that. It didn't go over well because it kind of is like a witch hunt. And then they started to resort to violence against the tax officials, and then that led to more boycotts. Really, it was not a good time to be a colonist in the United States, or probably a British soldier, because they're not going to be happy with them. So the British sent soldiers to protect the tax officials. In 1770, so we're taking a little jump, the Boston Massacre happens. So the British soldiers killed 5 colonists. There's a few stories as to what actually happened. So I'm going to tell one of them, where the first man that was killed was named Crispus Attucks. He was mulatto. Mulatto is a negative term today, but it basically means a mixed race and a runaway slave. So he probably was a son of an illegitimate son of like a slave woman and the plantation owner or something. What they said, or what one of the stories said, was he confronted British soldiers who were accused of striking a boy with rifles. There's another story of them having like a snowball fight and then hitting the soldier, or the colonists hit the soldiers and the soldiers returned fire. Like, there's a few stories. So what happened was how they got it to be the Boston Massacre, even though there was 5 colonists killed, was they hyped it up in the newspapers and were like, look at this massacre that happened, and trying to turn people against the British by kind of exaggerating the massacre of 5 people, which, I mean, killing people is not good, but I feel like 5 people wouldn't be considered a massacre. Townshend Acts are repealed at this time, except for the tax on tea, so in response to this. So hint, foreshadowing on the tax on tea. So 3 years later, the Tea Act. This allowed the East India Company to sell tea super cheap, but the colonists still boycotted because they were only allowed to buy tea from the East India Company, so they had a monopoly on the United States. This led to the Boston Tea Party. in December 16th of 1773. So this is the 21st of December when I'm recording it. So 5 days ago was the anniversary. The Sons of Liberty, which I previously mentioned, was, like, I feel like it's a hype group. Like, let's get these people riled up against the British, which they did that night. They dressed up as Mohawk Indians and dumped British tea overboard. So, in response, so this was in December, and I believe the Intolerable Coercive Acts were like January of that year. It was pretty early in 1774. They passed the Intolerable or the Coercive Acts. So this stopped trade between Britain and Boston. So they were mad at Boston, and so they stopped the trade. It also ended town meetings. This is just at Boston too. Ended town meetings, and Britain got more control, and then forcing the quartering of soldiers again. So, it was mainly at Boston that they were angry at, but, if you have that mentality of you are the United States, there's going to be people angry about it. September 5th, 1774 is the first meeting of the Continental Congress. So, the founders met to kind of figure out what they wanted to do, trying to get, break up with King George in Britain. In 1775, Lexington and Concord happens. So the United States started, or not the United States, they weren't the United States, but they started collecting military supplies as kind of like a, hey, we're going to start doing, revolting. The British found out and they occupied Boston because they were sent to destroy the supplies. And this is where the phrase "the British are coming" from, because they were set to warn when the British were coming for the military supplies. A conflict happened at Lexington and Concord, and some men were killed, and this really was like the start of the American Revolution. So that is, the stepping stones of why we were angry at Britain and why we wanted to declare independence. So that is it for today's lesson.